Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Solo Spotlight. I'm here with a returning guest, Celia Bugno, an art historian, the brain behind Highbrow Honey, the podcast. Last time we talked about uh, rewriting art history in plain English. This time we're digging into the art world in 2026 because social media and the art world is basically a giant museum right now, as well as the museums that are brick and mortar. So I'm happy to have you on again to talk about you tweaking your podcast, as well as how life as a art historian is going, and what we talked about, a busy season. Welcome back to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Ryan. I'm doing pretty well. I am definitely keeping busy these days. As you mentioned, we recently, royal we, I suppose, restructured Highbrow Honey to make the whole thing more sustainable for myself. And and otherwise, things are going really great. I am continuing to enjoy my work on the National History Day program through the Wisconsin Historical Society. We're about to head into our busiest season with that, so lots for me to do there.
Yeah.
I've also had the good fortune to kind of expand my art historical productions into book reviewing. I am, in fact, reviewing a book right now called, and excuse me one second while I
Yeah.
grab it.
Yeah, of course.
Greb Noir. This is about the militant artist poets of North Africa in the Pan African post colonial context of like the 1950s through 70s. And so that has been a really wonderful project to work on and expand my knowledge base on that time frame, the events going on in North Africa in those couple of decades there, and how the art connects to it. And furthermore, an exploration into poetry, which is a little outside of my usual visual wheelhouse.
hmm And is that book like a retelling, or is it like old literature?
It is essentially the author makes the argument that these poets were militants in and of themselves, and argues about their effects on the literature of that era, Maghrebian literature, and how they connected to some of the movements of that time period, such as Pan Africanism or negritude,
hmm
which are terms that we can get into a little bit if you
Yeah. Yeah, of course. No, talk to me more about that. That seems really interesting.
Yeah, so Pan Africanism is essentially this idea that came up um, following negritude. And negritude was more of a 1920s through 1940s thing, wherein a lot of specifically African American as well as other diasporic intellectuals, philosophers, authors, etc., started thinking about reclaiming Black identities and doing so through processes that involved decolonization not only of the land but of the mind.
Right.
And Pan Africanism was the sort of next stage that followed that line of thinking, and it centered on the idea of celebrating and unifying this recently post-colonial or in the midst of their fights for independence, this African current of reclamation, of celebration, and of trying to form a new future and a new political system that would be independent of the former colonizers in almost
Right.
every sense.
And it's really interesting you talk about that, because in one of our like terms we're going to talk about, it talks about like having receipts, and like this idea of let me get the term here first, the idea of provenance, or like how do we like gauge that as authentic, especially when you look at like deep history. Like, how do we track back? Because a lot of times, like, you have instances where this art is stolen and then it's like reclaimed as something else. So as like a historian, how do you like dig through the roots of that and find out like the true identity?
Yeah. That can be a sort of case by case basis because it all depends on I like the word receipts that you used, the receipts that we have or that we can uncover by returning to the archives, official documents, letters, journal entries, exhibition notes, and checklists. All those sorts of things can give us insight into who owned a work of art or whose hands it passed through, at least, whether that was for exhibition purposes or other reasons, at a given time. And in regards to the authenticity question, provenance can help us determine that something that appears like it could be an African sculpture from a given time period is in fact from that time period, is in fact by an artist who comes from somewhere in the continent of Africa. Um, However, authenticity is actually its own sort of hairy term in the art world because the the question remains kind of unanswered in many cases. Who is setting the standards for authentic? Who is defining that term?
Mm-hmm.
And by what metrics? Is this a authentic as determined by a person working in Calabar, Nigeria, or is this authentic as defined by a curator in Massachusetts?
Right.
Those kinds of things do make a difference. But in
Mm-hmm.
regards to just the sort of straight question you asked there regarding provenance, there are lots of written records that we refer to determine that sort of thing. Unfortunately, there can also be gaps in those records. I'm thinking here of a couple of um, headlines I've seen in recent weeks doing reviews for our business, our Tuesday news recap. There
Yeah.
have been instances where a family who is a descent of, for example, a Jewish collector who was in Germany or one of the other, what became occupied nations during World War II, who may have been more or less forced to sell off their art in the course of their fleeing, or maybe it was straight up stolen from them.
Right.
And then the record does not exist for what happened to it between some of those years of, say, for example, 1944 through 1965.
Right.
And because we don't have that written record, it can be more difficult to determine, especially in those cases where ownership is the question. Will this family get the work of art back, or will it stay in its current location, whether that be a private collection, a museum, etc.? The gap in the record can make the arguments for or against it leaving the collection or staying in the collection much more difficult simply because we don't have a clear answer. In
Mm-hmm.
some of those cases, it can be a relatively easy judgment call. It can be fair to assume that a work of art was stolen or otherwise unethically acquired. In other
Yeah.
cases, it's much less clear. And so we have to look a little outside of the written record of provenance and see what else we might be able to find about it, whether that be it's featured on the wall in a photograph of somebody's home or something like that. That's where things get fun, I'll say.
Yeah. So when you talk about this like depth of, what you're looking at now, and we kind of like contrast that with the podcast, and have there been any new like techniques or any new like styles that you've used to kind of like disseminate this content in order to like make it digestible for the average viewer?
Yeah, there definitely are strategies that I am starting to employ, even as of late February, early March here, where I am constantly working to make these compelling stories and the little knowns of art history that are interesting and relevant known. So, for example, one thing I've started here is our Sunday Secret Spotlight, which involves me naming a famous artist, whether that be Rodin, for example, our last one was on Rodin, and explaining something really unexpected about that artist, but that is kind of helpful context for us all to know when we're thinking about art history, or it might be surprising, it might challenge assumptions. For example, with the Rodin little spotlight there, which was an Instagram reel, I highlighted the fact that despite him being best known for his statue, The Thinker, of, I believe, 1889, the one of the gentlemen going like
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
Rodin himself was not a scholar. He was not an intellectual. He really struggled his way through schools and dropped out actually of a couple of national design schools along the way before he really figured out what he wanted to do as an artist and started making these really well-known and atypical for his time sculptures, these innovative forms.
Right.
So it's kind of ironic that
Yeah.
for a man known as the, creator of the icon of thoughtfulness, he wasn't always so much so himself,
Huh. That's really interesting.
right?
And and what have you kind of like since we last talked, you've been steadily releasing episodes. Uh, As like a personal note, what are some things that you kind of learned about yourself through like developing this podcast that since our last time talking, what do you think has changed in that?
Yeah, I think actually for a little while I kind of lost some of the passion that I was able to bring to our first collaboration together. I became really burned out working an unsustainable sort of schedule for the podcast of doing those once monthly episode drops. What I noticed is that it was not allowing me to really dig into some of these deeper questions that I have about specific artists, movements, etc. And instead, it was much more of a reactive kind of
Hmm.
process of I look at the calendar, oh my God, I have an episode that I'm supposed to drop in a week. And
And then
then
you're kind of
trying
just like
to
pushing things together.
exactly, yeah. And so what I have what I've done here, which I'm grateful to say has allowed me to bring back that passion and the parts of the art historical process that I like, is take that hiatus from Highbrow Honey
Hmm.
and restructure, especially our regular episode schedule.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, we're actually now going to be doing a mini series sort of format, and those would drop 3 to 4 times a year. For example, the first one that I'm looking at here, and I'll try not to spoil too much in
Of
advance.
course.
We're going to be doing a five-parter on Frank Lloyd Wright, who I keep hearing more and more about, especially being here in Madison in the near proximity to Spring Green, his kind of original home, and where the first Taliesin was constructed and still stands today. And I will be featuring a special guest who
Ooh,
worked with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation in those episodes. So, very, very excited
that
about that.
is.
Yeah, but it's been wonderful to, and I don't remember if I said, but that'll be coming in April, late April.
Okay.
And I'm really excited about that because I have been doing so much reading. I actually feel as though between the book review research and the Frank Lloyd Wright research, I feel like I'm back in college because I'm just, burning through article after article, book chapter after book chapter. My book that I'm using as a sort of main source for that one is about this thick. And I
Right.
have so many post it notes already in there. So, learning a little bit how to fall in love with the process of highbrow honey episode creation has been a major thing, major takeaway from the last several months. I've also definitely learned and been practicing my journalistic skills with the business segment,
Right.
really paring down to what is the most crucial information, but then also feedback that I had gotten from several of my friends and other listeners indicated that they wanted to hear actually more of my opinion and more about the why we cares, why I have selected this story, my perspective as an art historian. So I've been
Mhm.
really working on trying to do that, but also being mindful of the audience and not
Yeah.
being disrespectful to any specific points of views as strong of feelings as I have in regards to
Right.
certain topics.
Yeah, and you don't want to be like almost like controversial. Like you don't want to be like have and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think a lot of this when people like you have like a lot of credibility when it comes to this subject, and if you give like a take, you don't want it to be like too harsh or too like biased in some way, where then it kind of muddies the way that this is being viewed. Where then it's like I'm almost asking the audience, like I want you to think the way that I'm thinking, and it's very difficult. It's a fine line to but it's an amazing skill once you develop it to be able to say like, hey, I'm able to give my opinion, or I'm able to give like my hot take in like a very like kosher way, without like almost without
Yeah,
like be like creating like detractors in a way of like
yeah,
I'm starting to like rewrite history in a way.
yeah.
um
I do think a key part of that has to do with keeping the bigger picture focus, connecting the why we cares and the my opinions back to the larger stakes, whether they be freedom of speech, whether they be issues of national versus private funding, whether they be. I actually was working on our outline for this upcoming week, and I noticed one of our follow up stories that I wanted to include is in regards to Ireland solidifying into law a basic income program for artists in that nation.
right.
And that is a story that I'd like to feature because it speaks to the sort of validation of the arts as a lucrative, as a reasonable career choice, which
Yeah.
I think is an important thing to highlight because there is still, in my experience and through the headlines that we've seen, the changes in federal funding that we've seen, there is still this kind of underlying foundational opinion, it seems, in the United States that arts are not so viable. Arts are not a career that is worth pursuing and that will be financially supportive. And so featuring a story like that is it makes a connection to that bigger picture of challenging that assumption.
And when you look at like talking about, you know, history and museums in 2026, like what does that world look like right now? And like because you look at like tightening of budgets, financial constraints, as well as like culturally, like things are becoming more online. And like how do like historians like yourself and museums like adapt to these practices and kind of keep it current?
For sure. I think a good chunk of it has to do with not only what is in the physical exhibition itself in terms of the number of interactive exhibitions or exhibition components, which more often than not involve um, some screen or some headphone set or another. For example, I'm thinking of how many exhibitions I've been to in the last 3, 4 years that use artist interviews as a component of the exhibition that feature the artist talking about their own work. And of course, that's a little TV with the attached headphone set that you
Yeah.
can engage with. There are, of course, a much wider range of examples in a more family centered context. There might be, build your own blocks or something like that a child visitor might be encouraged to use. I do think the largest shift that we have seen has to do with the online presence and the way in which museums are taking social media, museums and other cultural institutions are taking social media seriously as an opportunity to disseminate information in the sort of norm aligned ways of that platform. So maybe you've heard, maybe not. There is I believe she's a curator at the National Gallery of Art, who in the past few weeks has become an internet darling because she goes around the gallery and features a piece and talks about it in very Gen Z slang, you know,
Hmm.
mentioning Riz, talking about the aura, etc.
Right.
And it's partially, it comes off a little bit funny, a little bit like
Yeah,
maybe
like
a
a little
joke.
corny
Exactly.
to like hardcore people, but
Right.
it's
And yet it's gotten so many hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions from people who don't maybe necessarily go out of their way to look at art or to engage with that sort of field. It's a way to make an impression on a group that the museum is trying to reach out to, which is young people. And that sort of adaptation to our tech-laden environment is absolutely something we're seeing across the board. I mean, even myself, I mentioned the Sunday Secret Spotlight reel. That is a way absolutely where I am trying
of
to reach
course.
new markets, spread the information that I feel is important, and provide a sort of short snippet information session to those who are looking for exactly that sort of thing via Instagram or other online sources.
Do you find too that like social media can often paint the art world or the this when we talk about like the emergence of abstract art where like
Mhm.
say you have a artist, quote unquote artist, and he's like hitting dudes in the head with like the pan liners, and then he's like giving them the pan liner and they're like, oh, this is crazy, or like they're throwing around paint, or and how much does that how much of that is still represented as like authentic art and like history or like a representation, and how much of this is like grifting, and
Yeah.
does this muddy the waters a bit?
Well, I'm very curious about that particular example you gave. Is that something you've
Yeah,
seen?
so like an artist, he had like those like roast pans, and he'd
Yeah.
basically like hit them over the head with the roast pan, and then it would make like an imprint, but every imprint would be different, and then the person
Yeah.
gets it and they're like,
Okay.
"Oh, this speaks to like my future of health or whatever it is." And you're like, "Okay," but to like the average person that doesn't like can't read into it that much, like, and it's on social media, and
Yeah.
in every way you would expect, it's gonna get like clowned. But is there some like, I don't know, is there some like backing behind that, or like this like abstract art and the way it gets like portrayed on social media, where then like any kind of idea of art is seen as like this grifting, or like, oh, it's only like rich people like buying up like aesthetic pieces, and it's not really like, and then to like
Yeah,
explain to people there's like a deep historic meaning in a lot of things. um
for sure. So my first question is has to do with finding out more. I guess my first instinct is curiosity, is finding out more about that artist in question, what they have stated about this practice, what it means to them, beyond just the participant reaction of, I now have this thing that has touched the artist's hand and that says something about me and them. Um,
right.
Performance art, I think, and that's the category that would absolutely fall into, is one of the most fascinating, nebulous mediums, and has been for all time. I really wish I could remember the name because I just tried Googling it off to the side here and I didn't get quite the right answer, which,
Of
AI,
course.
of
Yeah.
course, didn't give me the right answer. But there was an instance in the 1970s of perform. It was called performance art, and yet all that it was the artist being literally shot with a rifle in the, I think it was the arm, from across the room of this gallery, and that was the entire piece. Was just him getting shot, and so. Um, a lot of people would not necessarily consider that art or had questions about what is the implication here? What is the meaning here?
Mhm.
How does this qualify within something that could be considered art? And I still struggle a little bit to answer those questions myself. I think the main thing that makes it art is that it has, in my opinion, this sort of connection to Dadaist or like 1910s, 1920s Marcel Duchamp style questioning of why can't everyday objects or everyday occurrences become art? Why does it have to have a specific purpose? Does it have to be crafted for a specific meaning, or can we transform the meaning of an event or objects? And
Yeah.
so I think that has to do with probably the core of this particular
Yeah,
exhibit that you've brought up.
I just sent you a link. Click on that. It's a 30-second video.
Okay.
There should be in the chat there, and this is exactly what I'm.
Yeah. Wow, and he's really smacking them in the face with that too. Okay.
So he goes around with these,
Hmm.
and then, so then people see this, and even the guy that's commentating is like, "Look at this bullshit," and it's like, then when someone else looks at a different piece of media revolving art, it kind of like paints this picture, and kind of like without getting off track, it's just interesting because like we talk about like the authenticity behind it, and like how do we like how do we authenticate that as like what's like factual like history that has deep roots, and does that even when we look at it, things can be so abstract where like does that even play like a huge part in like yeah that's a different form of it, but like is this still something that is portrayed as like art, and like what if this guy gets super famous and all of a sudden you see those framed on walls, it's like well
Well,
then
just because something can be classified as art does not necessarily mean that it is good
good,
art in the sense
right,
that it makes a lasting statement that people return to time and again to question the meaning of.
right, yeah.
I
Eh,
think that's one that we might figure out the meaning of that and kind of be
yeah.
done with that fairly quickly.
So zooming out a bit, talking about your podcast, um, when you look at like the world in 2026, like what is you talk about Ireland? What are some other like big like headline things that are happening in like the art or museum world that like we're gonna start seeing emerge in this year?
For sure. Well, one thing that I have seen consistently in the last few weeks in the headlines has to do with, I want to think of how I'm going to phrase this. Controversy in regards to the statements made by artists, filmmakers, and other creatives, individuals or teams at some of the major international events. For example, I'm thinking the Venice Biennale last year had issues in regards to there being representation of Israel and what that might mean to essentially approve Israel into the event, whether that signified a larger approval of Israel and all of its current actions. There was a lot of very heated debate about that one, which I believe ended with the organizer of the Israeli pavilion deciding to cancel their presence.
Mm-hmm.
I believe I would have to double check that, but what I've noticed even in the last couple of weeks here, similar conversations are being had in regards to various other festivals. It's occurring across the world that artists are siding with Gaza and making that solidarity known and speaking out about the circumstances over there. And I mean, well, the UN's called it genocide. I'm going to call it a genocide. The genocide occurring over there. And there's been some very serious, mostly by political figures, responses to that. Accusations of anti-Semitism, for example. And yet, I think that trend is going to continue. Even just a week or two ago, we saw at the Berlin Major Film International Film Festival, the Berlinale, they call it, there were multiple film teams who won, say, Best Documentary or this or that category, and used their acceptance speeches to condemn Israel's actions and to support, verbally
Mhm.
support Palestine and display Palestinian flags, to wear keffiyehs, and all of that. So I think that is absolutely something we're going to continue seeing throughout the year. And we may even see escalations in the intensity, how much people are speaking about it, and in the debates as reactions to those sorts of public statements. Another
Right.
thing I think we're going to see is many more um, many more legal actions taken in regards to especially the federal funding cuts that were made in 2025. There have been so many lawsuits about those. I can't even count them all, keep track of them all. But the vast majority of all of the suits coming against the current Trump administration are in regards to losses of grants on the basis of some of the anti-DEI stances that the administration has taken. And
Right.
so we're going to, of course, continue to see those play out in the courts. And there seems to be no clear answers right now as to which way the courts are kind of leaning on this
Hmm.
issue. So that's one that I will be personally watching very closely to see what ends up happening there, how many of the grants end up being reversed, because there have been a few reversals already, and just generally what the public's role in those sorts of instances will be. Whether the American public will decide to go with the flow here in regards to the cancellation of those grants, or if we're going to see more support for the organizations affected by those cancellations. It
Right.
seems to be a fairly even divide on that within the public right now as well. So, yeah, those are
So
the two main
do you
things.
find like it, like when you look at governments taking a stance on this, it almost can like affect like the amount of awareness that you're getting as like an organization? Because if like the government is almost like not condemning music, but almost like by reversing a grant or by revoking things, it's almost like sitting on a stance of like it lacks importance, or like it's not worth it. And does that like, is that a fact? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think I see what you're saying there. So I would agree that yes, the message that seems to be conveyed with the cancellation of those grants is this issue or this arts endeavor or this group of people that would benefit from the grant, they don't matter. That definitely does seem to be the messaging. However, I think the Trump administration has almost done themselves a bit of shot themselves in the foot a little bit with this, because for as many of these instances of grants being revoked or pressure from especially mostly Republican lawmakers resulting in shows being shut down in Texas and multiple other red states, I guess you could
Yeah,
say,
Republican states.
is
Yeah,
exactly is that it draws all the more attention to that show or to that grant or to the organization that would have received the grant or the organization hosting the exhibition, because of the fact of the cancellation and the free speech implications that
yeah,
necessarily follow.
yeah. And it's like any publicity is good publicity. It's like even the fact that it's hitting the news. It's like then people are like, well, I got to check this out. I got to see what's really
Exactly.
going on and to form my own opinion. My
Precisely. Yeah.
my next topic I find very interesting because it's almost less related to anything, but related to everything all at once. And talking
Okay.
about the emergence of like artificial intelligence and how that affects like the world of like factual history, and how like is this over time going to destroy people's like perspective of history, when I can make a video of uh Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King in a rap battle and then
Mhm.
put it online? It is is something like this gonna almost like bend the like
The record, yeah.
reality, like the reality of what's actually going on? And like how do like museums and historians like curb this like this kind of like viral sensation?
For sure. So, I mean, I would hope, first of all, that anyone seeing a record or like a video that you just described there of Abe Lincoln and somebody else who lived,
But if
100,
I'm 14 years old
you would
and I
think, yeah,
right,
you would think that there might be some common sense. Okay, that's
right,
probably fake debunking. But we can't promise that in every case, especially if the misinformation presented is close enough to the
yeah,
historical fact for there to potentially be confusion. I think that what a lot of us don't necessarily think about when we think about AI is that its purpose is to more or less come up with answers that sound like the answers a human would give you. They are not always correct ones, and they are not always accurate ones. It's the AI essentially trying to please you by saying the thing you want to hear.
give you anything.
Exactly. And so I think the responsibility actually is really on every single one of us to verify that information through whatever means we possibly can, whether that's, I see, for example, a reel on, and the reels made by AI on like the Chinese Revolution, and there's something in there that really catches my attention, but I don't necessarily know that that fact is real. Well, then it's on me to consult some other sources. Go to a physical library and go find a book that has been peer reviewed and features, footnotes, citations, and all sorts of things for primary sources, if it's not a primary source itself, and review that information and make sure that the what I heard in the reel and what is verified in this book line up. I think
Mhm.
it's on us all to think critically, really, and practice our research skills and consider the motivation behind the information that might be presented, even if it's created by AI. Somebody had to post that on the internet.
Yeah.
And what was the motivation? What was the purpose of that person? What are they trying to make me think or believe, and why? That's a question we are going to constantly have to ask ourselves in the AI age.
Mhm. That's really interesting. I love how it's a responsibility of people to like learn themselves and come up with their own answer. And like that's I think that ultimately it sits the most with people. And I want to
I
take
know
this
it sucks. I know it sucks having to do your own work, but
yeah.
unfortunately, it will be very necessary.
And before we get into our segment,
Mhm.
I want to quickly touch on when we look at your podcast and we look at like someone getting into learning about history and learning about art, is there any like is there any piece of like podcast material that you've done that is a good like starting entry point for someone that is trying to understand like concepts or basic like language revolving around art? And we're going to get into that, but kind of where people can start off.
Well, I do think starting at the beginning with highbrow honey is a pretty reasonable thing. I know I explained quite a bit of my art historical journey, my pathway through my bachelor's and master's in that first episode. And I think that hearing that explanation of how I learned these skills and got to this point of general knowledge would be helpful for somebody looking to start and then build off of wherever it is they choose to start from. Our episode called Jargonology is another probably great resource because it
Yeah.
is just explanations of all of our go-to terms in the art historical world, along with some specific examples. I would also highly recommend listening to our episode Concrete Memories, because in that one it's it's entirely featuring monuments, specifically ones made out of concrete that were made at various times and for various reasons and to commemorate various things across the entire world. And I recommend that one especially because I repeatedly ask our listeners throughout that episode to think about the materiality of concrete and how it is largely seen as a very like steady, industrial, timeless, cold sort of material, unemotional sort of material, and
Hmm.
yet it's used in all these monuments and more and memorials. And
Right.
how that might the associations of concrete might affect our viewing of an artwork versus if it had been made out of wood, which is something
Right.
that I would consider much more personal, much more warm, much more kind of everyday commonplace,
Decorative.
grounded, earthly, even. Yes. So that I think would be a helpful discussion for someone
Yeah.
to think
Yeah.
about when they're starting
It
on things
is
that are historical.
it is interesting because you look at like different things, whether they're made out of concrete or marble or and
Hmm.
how like it signals a certain type of thing. And yeah, it's very interesting because you almost have to think about that in a way of like, why did the artist choose
Yeah.
to make it with this specific material?
Yeah.
Um,
It is always an intentional choice every time.
yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And kind of breaking into our segment, our nice meat and potatoes of this episode, and I think this is going to give the a big value to our listeners when we talk about history. And I think this probably it closely relates to your jargonology episode when we talk about this, but kind of talking about terms that are carried through like history and like historians and how this kind of relates to what we see it now in 2026 and how we kind of translate these old terms into like new age terms or how we can contrast it. So with every topic we're going to run through, we're going to talk about what this term actually means in a human language when we break it down. What would be an appropriate 2026 equivalent, and what is a real example that people would recognize of this term today in their everyday life? And
Yeah.
also, why does this term matter?
Hmm.
So the first term we're going to talk about is canon.
Yep. So canon historically has referred to the art movements, works of art, artists that have been considered significant in some way. Probably because, like we talked about good art earlier, their pieces have demonstrated innovation or raised a debate which still has questions unanswered. They would have been, these are artworks that would have been shocking for their time, most likely, or else, on the other hand, iconic for their time. They may very fully encapsulate something about a particular culture in that moment. I'm thinking here of the shocking versus iconic examples. Shocking would be something like Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which is a urinal that just was
Hmm.
turned on its side. Nobody expected that, but it questioned the very meaning of fabrication in the arts, whether an artist themselves has to create the thing or if they can sign their name to it with a couple of edits to the thing.
Right.
And then the iconic would be something from the Rococo, like Fragonard's The Swing. You don't get much more on the nose for what that particular side of noble French society was like at that time.
Right. And it kind of like can is kind of like what people like unanimously decide is like a piece, kind of, or like what
As a
like
as a
institutions, critics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be fair to say. Um, the thing about canon that I've noticed, and maybe this is just my own opinion, but I've noticed in the past several years is as continuous efforts are made to recognize overlooked artists, especially if they had been overlooked on the basis of ethnicity, race, gender, whatever, the quote unquote canon keeps growing infinitely larger. And it almost has lost its significance as a term because there are so many works of art, artists, movements, etc., that are now being validated in the way that being inducted into the canon, it's like the same amount of meaning these days to
Hmm.
have that happen.
And when
And so I wonder if we even really need the word canon anymore, if that's sort of fallen by the historical
right.
wayside.
So it's interesting you say that because looking at it and looking at the idea of what it means, like when I kind of thought about this, I said like a 2026 equivalent to this word, I uh I would say is like algorithms.
I could see that argument for sure.
Because the algorithm is deciding what piece of content is notable or kind of
Yeah,
pushing things up to the top. So instead of an
yeah, absolutely.
institution or critic, it's more or less social media algorithms that are almost like
It's
deciding,
movies.
right.
Yes.
And that like that is what I personally think, and like giving like a real world example, I think we could land at like maybe social media
Hmm.
would be like an idea of like this algorithmic canon, if
To
we could
some degree, yes, absolutely. I think you're actually dead on. I'm really impressed by that argument. I My brain first goes to sort of the earliest edition of that would probably be Vines. I mean, how
yeah,
many of us remember Hurricane Tortilla and all those other little sound bites
right,
that still get brought up today, and which definitely inspired the reels, TikToks, the sort of short clip laden environment that we see dominating social medias today. I think you're absolutely right in that there when the groundbreaking nature has shifted to being centered not on necessarily works of art but on original humor or even
uh-huh,
referential humor. But I
right.
think that is very true that algorithms kind of and like counts and comment counts and all that today determine what could be considered the canonical of
Right.
social media versus the art critics and institutions of the past.
And when we look at that, does the idea of following a trend, was that consistent when we look at art in the past of a lot of artists would follow a trend in order to kind of follow that suit of getting acceptance by critics and institutions?
There are definitely artists for whom that was the case. There are
Like
definitely
they were
artists.
the trendsetter and then everybody tried to replicate that style.
Yeah, yeah. I could say Michelangelo, Raphael, they were kind of some of the OGs of that in their day in the Renaissance. But there are also notable exclusions still. For example, Edouard Manet, who shocked the French salons time and again with his various nude women who were self possessed and looking back at the viewer, kind of confronting them
Mhm.
with their ogling of her,
Right.
and challenged a lot of the representational norms of the day, which I mean, now there's God knows how many artists creating nude images of all sorts of people.
And it's so funny you say that because the next term we have is the male gaze.
I I kind of knew. I was expecting to make that transition,
Yeah.
honestly. So
Um, so
the,
let's talk about that because I find that so fascinating. When I did my research on this term, it was basically they would create pictures of women that were intended to be looked. The viewer was males. Is that correct?
yes, for a while there, just because of the social expectations or rules of the day, the salons and other viewing platforms or venues were very male dominated, especially if they were something like the salon, which was hosted by the national arts institutions. Well, the only people allowed to attend the national arts institutions were male students. So, of course, that's going to be a largely male dominated room. And essentially, the idea of the male gaze was and is that there can be ways in which, especially women figures in art, are portrayed in such a way that they exist solely for pleasure. They're not three-dimensional characters, but they are kind of meant to provide visual stimulus that would be considered enjoyable. They're not. These are women figures who are not reacting to the fact of being looked at. These are women figures who maybe have unrealistic proportions, or who to whom gravity doesn't seem to apply. We can actually mark the point in history uh, where men artists started like recognizing that gravity affects how boobs lay,
Right.
and so we no longer have gravity-defying boobs.
Right.
Um, and that, but that would be a feature that had existed in the past in regards to male gaze, and really what the idea of that means in art history and art criticism is trying to avoid looking at these images, even if that's what they were created for, as simply ways to gain visual, emotional pleasure, whatever, from the sight of a nude woman. And I did
Right.
specifically bring up Edouard Manet's works, especially Olympia, his painting Olympia, because they were they were challenges in a lot of ways to the male gaze, and they were relatively early. They were mid to late 19th century, when it was absolutely still commonplace to believe that women were sexual objects and that they were created for the pleasure of men, and so on. Yet what Manet did is he had his women and many more have since taken up this tradition. I'm thinking specifically of Lisa Yuskavage, who was an artist I featured in my master's thesis, who look back at the viewer, who react to that gaze upon their body, however revealed it is, nude, semi-nude, and who essentially challenge the right or the ability of a viewer, whether they actually be male or not, to simply enjoy her body for what it is. These
Hmm.
are figures who don't conform to the male gaze, especially Manet's and Yuskovich's. They look back at you with smirks, or they have a sort of inescapableness to them, where you feel as though you are looking at almost a more live person, and being forced to navigate the sort of interpersonal relationships with a three-dimensional developed human being.
Right. Yeah, it like invokes an emotion of like, oh, like you it could make people uncomfortable or make like, it's very interesting. And when we like contrast this to like what that looks like in 2026,
Mhm.
it it kind of still brings us back to like social media and how like the the idea of like are creators making work for people, or are they creating it for like a retention purpose? And when we look at like people creating art for the male gaze, was this something that they were creating because they enjoyed this piece of art, or was it more for a shock value of, does that make sense?
Well, I guess I'm wondering about which kind of context you're referring to, because Manet, late 19th century, is might have a different answer than Yuskovic, who was like the 1990s, 1980s,
Right.
1990s, and
Right.
still works today. But that was what I would say was probably the point where she made her splashy entrance to
Right.
the art world.
I'll rework the question. Do you think as it's evolved over time, the more the idea of making it for like the pleasure of viewers, is it to have them enjoy the piece of art or to react to the piece of art?
Oh, I think that it's still important to most artists that their work of art be considered aesthetically enjoyable or aesthetically valuable, more likely aesthetically valuable. But I do think the prerogative of shocking or otherwise making the viewer think has become much more universal. I think there are very few works of art that are being produced, especially in 2025 and 2026, that are not asking larger questions, but that just have pure aesthetic value.
Hmm.
I think everybody's trying to connect to our context these days, and with good reason.
Of course. And when you look at our next topic is patronage, and how do we view patronage now in like a 2026 landscape when we talk about, because it basically what I looked at, it was like whoever pays for the art steers the art.
Yes, I do think that has been historically true to some degree. It certainly was true of oh goodness, what was his name? Something as famous as the Arnolfini portrait, which was Jan van Eyck, which was done as a commission, and which, yes, the artist used some of the details of that painting to feature his technical mastery and even experiment a little bit with some of the limitations of painting. How much could one represent in a single work of art? You could even say a little bit Michelangelo. He definitely had some contention with in regards to the Sistine Chapel ceilings with the Pope of the day. There's a very famous anecdote about him making, I think it's one of the devils have that Pope's face or something like that, one of the damned maybe, and that just constantly continues. I mean, even in the course of my Frank Lloyd Wright research, there were multiple times where his clients would say, hey, I don't really like this feature, or that floor plan doesn't include these things that I asked for, or something along those lines. And Wright's response would typically be, a bit egotistically, I think, well, you don't know what you want. I know what you want. I know what
Mm.
you need. I'm going to tell you how it's going to go because I know better than you. And so patronage can be a very complex relationship. I wouldn't say that any two instances are exactly the same, but patronage has also gone from, in the course of art history, being uh, a much more amorphous thing. So way back when, in Michelangelo's day, for example, or the time of the Arnolfini portrait, you had either the church, and I do mean the Catholic Church there, you had either the church or perhaps an individual in a very powerful family, a royal themselves maybe even, commission that artwork. And so when you're working with a royal who could imprison or behead you, you of course have to be more considerate of their wishes.
Hmm.
But that's also just the one entity who's paying your bills. As we look at the 2025 or even just 21st in general century context, we're seeing all sorts of patronage and that we're seeing all sorts of sources. That could be a gallery, that could be a museum, that could be an individual, perhaps millionaire or whatever. It could be a nonprofit organization, even I've heard of, who commissions a work of art for to memorialize a specific achievement or milestone. It could be that the artist or art producing business in question gets federal funding, state funding, private donations from an unnamed source. There's just so many more things that could be a source of patronage that term almost has also ceased to have meaning.
Hmm. Our next one is, and we talked about it early on in the show, uh, provenance. And
Provenance, yeah.
yeah, and how do we look at that? Where we look at things that are more of a digital landscape now, but the idea of this is kind of like what we said is like receipts, right? Like where does this art come from? How whose hands has it passed through? What galleries has it been through? who's had it, who's sold it, and that kind of tracks it down to like the authenticity of the work. When we look at that in broader terms, how do we count authenticity now?
Hmm. I would say that a contemporary definition of authenticity is darn near impossible to achieve. There have been scholars who've been working on that much longer than I have, and I think the foundational problem in defining it is the question of um, othering, essentially, because in the process of seeing, for example, Cambodian art as Cambodian, we are, as you and I, as people from the United States, we are immediately identifying that we have no personal connection to that Cambodian artwork's history, to that the artist behind it. We are not a part of that community. And so we may have certain expectations regarding that artwork, that artist, etc. And depending on the economics involved, depending on what exactly that support might look like, whether we're looking to buy the work of art, whether we're looking to feature the artist in a show that takes place here in the US, there could be questions of authenticity that center on how whether the artist is kind of bending to meet us halfway, or if their original intentions, their historical connections via the artwork, via the I guess you could say the medium, their local community significance to that artwork, whether that's all being affected by the fact of us two being from a different culture, that's where the heart of it lies.
Mm-hmm.
There is possibility, of course, that if said artist is in a tough financial spot, that they may consider just telling us what we want to hear and meeting those expectations that we bring in the hopes that they can financially benefit because they may
Right.
need to. And believe you me, I'm not knocking anybody else's financial decisions or circumstances. I myself have gone through some rough times in the past few years. So I'm just thinking, even from a personal standpoint, of how I might feel or what I might be willing to do if I were in said artist's shoes.
Right. And then that idea of like the information being passed is
Hmm.
kind of like out of like a survival instinct. So you really don't know whether or not, because
In
throughout
the example,
history, yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, and you would think that it would get easier over time, but it almost gets harder because now with the emergence of AI and all of these things,
yeah.
it almost becomes more things to sift through or more information that might overwhelm someone
Right.
trying to go on their own fact finding mission.
Yeah, I think that's true for sure. I was actually catching up with my one of my undergraduate mentors, Dr. Jordan Fenton, earlier this morning. He does a lot of work with, especially uh, masquerade performance events in Calabar, Nigeria. And that was something that he and I talked a lot about when I was an undergraduate, especially when I was his research apprentice for about a year there. Just what do the political and economic circumstances of every party involved in realizing and or showing and or purchasing a work of art, how do those affect the dynamics of that exchange?
Hmm. Yeah. Eh, Going into our last term, for
Hmm.
everybody that's listening, we talked about this a lot on episode 36 of Solo Spotlight, talking about the term Rococo. Um, uh, I find this is something that we are seeing happen again. We're seeing like a reemergence of this type of what I kind of labeled it as like aesthetic consumerism.
Aesthetic consumerism is definitely a good terminology for that. Um, I do understand the drive in our current circumstances, worldwide, much less national, to practice a little escapism by looking at things that are pretty and that bring us joy, but don't necessarily ask us to think about the hard stuff. Like I said, I don't think there's a lot of artists, professional artists, who are going solely that route. I do think that it is a sort of hobby for many of us to be a source of some of those good feelings, kind of entertainment based productions. And I do think that there are parallels in that regard with there are formal similarities, let's say, between the paintings that came out of and the meanings, the motivations behind the works that came out during the Rococo, the French, 19th century. I'm, I'm terrible with the century numbers. But at the same time, of course, it's a similarity of some of the end results. It's not necessarily exactly alike. We aren't necessarily seeing more of Fragonard's The Swing in just new ways, but we are seeing, I would say, also differences between the purposes of creating the pretty things. In the Rococo period, it was more of a celebratory practice. It was capturing the way that the nobility felt so good because they were so they were able to be much more loosey-goosey, free kind of than they had under the previous king. They were doing really well financially. They had all these wonderful castles, these beautiful places like Versailles that they could reside in. They were making the pretty things because life was really, really good.
Hmm.
We are making the pretty things because sometimes life is really, really not.
Yeah.
And so I think there are some fundamental differences in the context to consider, but there are definitely important similarities in the goal of aesthetic appreciation and
Hmm.
making something that someone can look at and kind of escape into for a little while.
Right. Yeah. And like, I think honestly, like when we look at it, like whether or not it's like curating joy or like status signaling, I think at the end of the day, it's it's pretty like harmless in a way. Like you're
In a
I I
way.
I don't think the idea of it is like malicious in nature. Like I think whether or not you're like it's ultimately like trying to make yourself feel better. Now again, like
Yeah.
whatever like personal turmoil that someone might be going through in order to obtain this kind of like art or uh aesthetic, but
Hmm.
I think honestly like when we look at the big picture, I don't think there's much wrong with like trying to get a break from something and like
Yeah.
appreciate whether it's not to show to your friend of like look at the $1 billion piece I have or whatever it is, or
Yeah.
it's something that you sit alone and you look at yourself. I think ultimately at the end of the day, like even when we look at it now, it's a fairly like harmless.
Escapism in small doses, let's say.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Exactly. And
Yeah.
when we look at it, like a lot of these concepts, they didn't disappear wholly, although they've probably changed and they changed their outfits a bit. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's very interesting. That kind of wraps up our discussion about these terms. But I think that gives like a little digestible piece of these fundamental art terms and kind of how that relates to like a 2026 parallel. So
Hmm.
thank you for coming on that journey with me.
Of
Um,
course.
but I want to talk about you and where you're like, what's next for you. So you talked about the next thing you're planning on covering in April, and
Hmm.
what are some other things that you have exciting going on with Highbrow Honey, and like, what are some things that you're excited to share with your audience?
For sure. So We have also updated the Patreon tiers, so now there's a couple other options in there in terms of ad-free content, exclusive content, specifically some potential guest interviews that I am working through scheduling for the, I guess you could say, like second and third business quarter of the year, so summer
Hmm.
and fall.
Right.
We have since the last time I was on your show, we have launched a Substack component. So there are now written blog posts and resources and all sorts of things for those who are interested. And a number of them are free. Of course, if you're a subscriber to the Substack, you can access the rest of them.
Hmm.
I am also excited to continue with our 5-minute musical format, which is also a pretty obvious name. I tend to give my things very alliterative, obvious names, but it's as close to 5 minutes as I can make it, a music video breakdown of something that had cultural value, maybe connected to art history in some significant way. And so I'm excited for February's, which we should be dropping very shortly here. That was Beyonce and Lady Gaga's Telephone.
Right.
And then we're going to switch it up again in March here. We're going to go with Fountains of Wayne, Stacy's mom. And
Okay.
so that's been a really fun pursuit, a challenge for me as an art historian to look at the moving stuff instead of something that's staying still.
Hmm.
And something I look forward to bringing our listeners insights about.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when you look at music videos, you don't see a lot of music videos being made today, but when they are, there is like a lot of cultural significance that the artist is trying to share with someone. And it is very interesting to dig into that and look at all of the subtle Easter eggs, we would call it, that these
Yeah.
artists are leaving that you would almost like I always think to myself like, oh, it's so crazy that people are making things and they don't care whether or not, like, not that they don't care whether or not people see them, but it's like
Yeah.
whether or not they just enjoy it at surface level or they read into it. It's very
Mhm.
interesting because it's like you're almost seeing like one of those things of like, is it a purple dress or a green dress? And then you have
Yeah.
people like debate on whether or not. So it's very good. Like, and just to give people explanation, I think it's so good to have that like knowledge base. And I think that's an amazing addition to your catalog of what you got going on. Um, when we look at someone looking into like gaining better taste or visual literacy in a way, what's like a starter pack? Give me one artist, one era, and one habit that someone could start that would give them better visual literacy, that they would be able to understand the taste of things.
Well, taste is very individual, and I want to
Mhm.
leave leave that one open for every person to develop for themselves. But just in terms of a starter pack, um, let's see, artist era and a tip, you
and
said?
and one habit that someone could do in like a day-to-day life.
So I would say there are, first of all, many, many creators like myself who do these spotlights of various artists or artworks or whatever. Even if that's your local art museum, the Chicago Art Institute, the Baltimore Museum of Art, something LACMA in California, whatever your local one is, I would follow them on social media and keep an eye out for some of those highlight moments because, in the course of those sorts of videos, especially where a curator is explaining the history or the impact of a work of art, they will guide you along the process of looking at it like an art historian. They'll tell you, notice this feature that connects to this other artwork and or this type of experiment that the artist was trying to do at the time, or maybe the materiality had to do um, with them trying to innovate in that medium, whatever. I would also suggest that when you're able to, especially if you're visiting art in person, look at it for much longer than you think you need to. Like, really sit down and stare at that thing for minutes, not just seconds, because the more, especially the more detailed the work of art is, if it's something from the Renaissance or Reformation, Northern Renaissance kind of period, it will be very, very detail laden. And every one of those details will mean something. For example, you might notice in a work of Christian art, there could be the figure of Mary, and you'll almost always see her in blue. That was her color kind of assigned to her to, to make her identifiable in works of art at that time period. Mary Magdalene will almost always be in red for the same reason. And so I guess that could be kind of a tip for an era.
Yeah.
And in regards to a specific artist that I would recommend starting with, I've mentioned him a lot this episode, but I do feel as though he's just such an already known and accessible starting point is Duchamp,
Hmm.
him and the Dadaists, because the sorts of questions, very basic, fundamental questions that they were asking about art, its production, its reception, art history, the canon, all of that, those are the sorts of questions that anyone starting down this path would probably have themselves. And
Hmm.
so to to look at something that is challenging and intentionally so, I think is a really great practice for learning how to come to your own conclusions given a specific historical context or knowing that Duchamp liked to kind of play around with these sorts of things.
Right. That's so interesting. And I think that's a great starter for people to gain visual literacy. And just to wrap this up, I wanted to say thank you for coming back on the show again. This was an amazing episode. I'm glad we could dig even deeper into the history, art, looking back into history and diving down that rabbit hole a little further. For people that are looking to check you out and see what's going on with Highbrow Honey, where can they find you and where are you most active on?
We are probably most active on our Instagram, which is simply highbrow_honey. We, of course, have the Patreon and the Substack that I mentioned. If you just Google our name, Highbrow Honey, with either of those two terms, you will almost definitely find us. And of course, our episodes stream everywhere on Apple
Yeah,
Music, Spotify, anything that you can think of, just about. So we try to be as accessible as possible.
that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. Everybody go check out Highbrow Honey. Go see Celia Bugno. She's doing great work, always coming up with innovative things, got some amazing stories coming up. If you learned something today, send this episode to a friend that also is looking into art and wondering what it all means. With that, that has been another episode of Solo Spotlight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, sign up for Spare Bedroom Studios, clips daily, episodes weekly, and we will see you next week.
Thanks again, Ryan.